todos, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos a esta gran entrevista que vamos a tener en el canal de Pequeño, Cerdo, Capitalista. Hoy vamos a tener al doctor Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. Él es autor de 3 libros que creo que necesitas en tu vida y necesitas regalárselo al Departamento de Recursos Humanos. Si tú eres el fundador de una empresa, lo tienes que leer, y si no, se lo tienes que dar al fundador o director o etcétera, porque básicamente él ha trabajado toda su vida en algo que creo que necesitamos desesperadamente, que es cómo podemos ser más productivas o productivos, pero tener más tiempo de descanso, tener vidas más equilibradas. Entonces, si tú quieres saber un poquito más de todos estos temas, de cómo trabajan las empresas que únicamente van a la chamba 4 días a la semana o tienen jornadas de 6 horas, cómo estos unicornios mágicos increíbles son posibles, básicamente, y cómo podemos también nosotros tener una vida donde el descanso no significa nada más estar viendo ahí las redes sociales o sentirnos culpables por el tiempo que descansamos. Quédate. Well, today we'll talk with Dr. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, a leading voice in reduced hours working. He's the author of 3 books exploring how companies and individuals can better integrate rest, creativity, and focus in the digital age. They are shorter: How Working Less Will Revolutionize the Way Your Company Gets Things Done, Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, and The Distraction Addiction, that was published in 2013. He has given talks around the world on the future of technology and work in venues ranging from the CIA headquarters in Langley to the Globe Theatre in London to the Google Plex in Silicon Valley, and before joining the 4-Day Week Global, where Alex is designing pilot programs, advising companies, leaders, and employees interested in shorter work weeks and working to build 4-Day Work Global as a leading advocate for the work-day week. He was a research director at the Institute of the Future and a senior consultant at Strategic Business Insights, and lectured at Oxford University, Stanford University, and UC Berkeley. Alex received a PhD in History and Sociology of Science from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, you are very, very, very welcome in this YouTube channel. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks very much. And thanks for having me on.
I wanted to tell you a very short story of how I found you. It's very funny because I was really stressed that day, and I was using an app that I really like that is called Calm, a meditation app. And lucky for me, they have a short class on the power of rest. And for me, this was amazing because it was like some short ideas about one of your books, Rest, but it really made me think that maybe I was feeling so burnout or so exhausted, overworked, because I was not really giving space for rest. And with this very interesting idea that you have on why rest is not really slacking off, but the fuel of productivity. So I found you through this app, then I devoured all your books, first Rest, and then Shorter. We will talk about both of them. And I read Shorter during the pandemic. So for me, it was very interesting because I really, really, really wanted to implement some of those ideas for my working hours, but also for my company. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. And I'm very glad to hear the story of how you discovered rest, and also glad that your experience with it was positive enough to seek out its sequel. So appreciate that.
I am very curious about who were you before you became like this great researcher and advocate for productivity, but in a more balanced and restful and creative way. Mm-hmm. What were you doing before? How did you get interested in this?
I think, like a lot of people, I discovered the value of rest the hard way. As you'd mentioned, I'd been working for uh, a think tank called Institute for the Future, and I'd been there about 7 years or so, and it was fascinating work, lots of interesting clients, but I always had that feeling, which is, I think, typical in Silicon Valley and unfortunately typical in sort of more and more parts of the world, of always being kind of half a project behind, and having the sense that, if if only I could sort of put in more work, sort of do more, then I could finally get caught up. But of course, there is no such thing as getting caught up. And so that was, and eventually I ended up leaving that job, and fortunately had the offer to go to Microsoft Research Cambridge to take a sabbatical there and to do the work that eventually became my book, The Distraction Addiction. But when I was there, about halfway through, I had kind of a revelation, which was that I was sitting in a coffee house with sort of my wife, and realized I was getting enormous amounts of work done. And I was having these great ideas. I was doing a lot. I was writing a lot, but I didn't feel the sort of stress and time pressure that is, just part of everyday life here in the Valley. And it made me think, maybe our assumptions about the relationship between sort of overwork, between sort of our assumptions about the inevitability or inescapable nature of long hours and burnout, and that these are things that you have to do in order to do great work. Maybe our assumptions are actually sort of backwards. That in order to do work that you're really passionate about at a level that sort of satisfies both your kind of your ambitions, but also makes you feel like you've done something, sort of meaningful with your life. Maybe it's actually necessary to kind of paradoxically to ease up, to work less, and to sort of make space in your life for kinds of rest that that help you be more creative, that allow you to sort of recharge the mental and physical batteries that you spend working really hard. And that if you can figure out how to balance these things, you can do so in a way you can figure out a way of working that is both quite productive, but also far more sustainable. And that, or that epiphany that evening kind of was one that I didn't act on immediately or start to work on, but it's also one that didn't go away. And a couple of years later, I finally started doing research into it and realized there actually were a lot of very famous, highly accomplished people who had discovered the value of rest, often after periods of burnout or nervous breakdowns or things, and who learned to balance work and rest in very specific kinds of ways that clearly helped them be more creative, but also to have better, longer, more productive lives. And that there was a body of research in neuroscience and the psychology of creativity that explained why it was that these patterns worked. And so when I had those two things, right, the stories of Nobel Prize winners or famous authors or composers, and sort of the science that helped us understand sort of what made these patterns sort of so powerful, I realized this was a story really worth sort of telling. So that's the origin story of rest.
Just to get a little bit more into the gossip, how were
Mm-hmm.
your days in the sabbatical? Because I mean, I've read Rest,
Mm-hmm.
and we have many examples of Nobel Prizes that in the morning they would work 4 hours, very concentrated, full time doing productive stuff, and then in the evening they would go for a walk or even skiing
Mm-hmm.
or playing chess or playing something totally different. How was your sabbatical structure, and or why do you think that you became so creative during those years?
Well, partly I think it was or the creativity came partly from being in a different location, in a place that that I really liked. I was also in Cambridge in the winter, and if you've ever been in England in the winter months, it's a great time to stay indoors and get work done, because it's cold, it's rainy. The attractions of the English countryside in the spring and summer are not really available to you, and so as nice as it is, it's great to it's actually a great time to to get stuff done. At the same time, it was at the daily level, I would get up. I wouldn't get up super early. That was not a habit that I had yet developed, but I would be in the office during regular working hours, and then would in the evenings, generally go out with my wife. There are lots of cool historic pubs and other places to explore. On the weekends, we might go down to London or somewhere else. And so at the daily level, my life looked pretty much the way that it always had, but there was a lot more leisure kind of on the weekends and in evenings and other periods. And so that was my first introduction to a kind of schedule that had more rest built into it, that also seemed not to be merely a break or a distraction, but seemed generative and productive.
And actually, that's one of the very interesting parts of rest. And I will get back to this kind of active or different way of resting that is not just, okay, I want to rest, so I'll go and scroll my phone just to get distracted, which is not resting. We end up being more exhausted. But why do we feel so guilty and unproductive when we rest? And why is this a misconception? And it's even counterintuitive, but it's worse if we don't rest for our productivity.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very big question, and I think that the briefest answer is that, number one, there have been times when rest was seen not as a deviation from success, or as a kind of a moral failing or something, but was regarded as kind of a reward for one's hard work. I think that there used to be a vision of professions and careers in which, as you became more skilled, more successful, one of the rewards of your investment of time and energy earlier in your career was an ability to be a little more relaxed about your work later on. And I think that there's what's happened is that, number one, there has always been a strain, at least in American culture, of thinking of overwork as virtuous, as hard work, not just as something that generates wealth for you personally, which is a big incentive for lots of Americans, but also is a sign of how good a person you are. Now, I think that this has become a kind of cornerstone of American culture, or Americans' perceptions of themselves, really in the last couple generations. I would say starting in the 1970s with the oil shocks and recessions and economic troubles. Then what you began to see was a shift away from a vision of work and careers as things in which you made steady investments and got steady returns, right? There was an era in American history when both General Motors and General Electric, the two biggest companies in the United States, were both led by guys named Charlie Wilson, both of whom had started in the mail rooms of their respective companies and then worked their way up to the corner office. In the 70s and 80s, this kind of vision of careers gets destroyed and replaced with one in which success is something that happens very quickly. The Forbes 30 under 30 list becomes the kind of icon of this vision, where you become really successful very quickly or not at all. Right, the tech industry, finance, these become the kinds of exemplars of what success looks like now. At the same time, in the professional classes and in blue collar work, you have a kind of hollowing out of security so that these jobs become more precarious. It becomes necessary as a kind of survival strategy to to simply work longer hours in order to either make ends meet or to demonstrate your your professionalism and your passion for your work. And then I think that the other thing that helps make this seem normal is that we come at a certain point to a period where simply everybody is doing this. And, your mentors work this way, your colleagues work this way. And in order to fit into the workplace, to not let your friends down, this becomes the way in which you work as well. And so, what had been at one point a really fairly radical idea about the place of work in our lives, namely that it should, take up ever larger portions of our lives, slowly through a combination of kind of psychological factors and economic ones become the norm. And I think that it makes it very difficult, but not impossible, to ask, all right, how can this be different, right? How can we as either as individuals find opportunities to work rest back into our daily schedules or into our lives, or even more radically, as organizations, how can we make this available to everybody? But it is a set of ideas that are supported by a bunch of different strains or trends that have reinforced each other and have helped make long hours and overwork seem both inevitable and inescapable.
And I think that's very interesting because we think that when we are resting, we are being lazy. But
Yes.
What I like from your first book, that then the second book, I'm giving a little bit of a spoiler, but I'm just saying it so people can read both. How can you do this in companies in order to make them even more productive, profitable, and even reduce the turnover that is
right.
awesome and it's very costly. But why having like structure working time and structure time for rest is not being lazy first, and is different to have this kind of idea that rest is a part of productivity and not like the antagonist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think part of the challenge is that we no longer see rest as a source of insight or creativity the way that we might have really a couple centuries ago. There was Joseph Piper wrote a fantastic book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that argued that up until, let's say, the 18th century, this was the idea of labor, of hard work as the thing, as the place that generated insights, was really pretty foreign in Western thought, and that everybody agreed that it was in periods of reflection, contemplation, whether this is prayer or secular, that this was where great ideas and of cultural achievements were born, not through the kind of hard graft or of work that you associated with the laboring classes. What has happened over time is that, in a sense, we have come to sort of distrust the idea of leisure as a source of insight, as a source of creative ferment, and have sort of pushed it to the side in our thinking about work and achievement. Likewise, rest itself has come to be seen as the opposite of work, or sort of a kind of negative space defined by the absence of labor, rather than something that is worthwhile in itself, that sort of generates value, and that should be seen as a kind of complement to sort of labor, rather than its competitor. Now, and I think that finally, what this is promoted is a sense of sort of rest as something that's completely passive, right? You think of sitting on a couch with a bag of salty snacks in one hand and a remote control in the other. And for most, and that's the kind of stereotype of what rest is now. It's entirely passive. You're turning your brain off. And in reality, the most restorative forms of rest turn out to be active. First of all, things like as simple as sort of walking, or sort of exercise, gardening, doing sort of things that are sort of more mentally and especially physically engaging. And that, very often the things that bring us the greatest rewards when we rest actually are things that are kind of challenging. And either they're physically challenging or they're mentally challenging, but because they take us kind of farther away mentally from the office, allow us to escape sort of its challenges or other problems, and and allow us to find sort of respite in activities that sort of we really enjoy. And there is terrific value in that, both for sort of our creative lives, but also for sort of our development as people, and for sort of the quality of our lives.
Actually, that was a very interesting idea that I now try to use more. In your book, you say, in the first one, Rest, you say that if you want to rest from mental fatigue, you need to do something physical. Mm-hmm. And if you want to rest from physical fatigue, you need to do something more with your brain.
Yes, this is one reason that lots of famous writers, mathematicians, sort of scientists, people who we would normally stereotype as being sort of like nerdy people who would not be particularly athletic, are actually pretty serious athletes. And that, what we find is that there is a value in sort of finding kinds of rest that are that can be radically different from your work, but and you get bonus points in a sense if there are things about that activity, about that hobby, that actually sort of reconnect you to the things that you like about work at its very best. I think that the one of my favorite examples is climbing, like rock climbing. And there are lots of scientists who are really into rock climbing, and also executives, like business people. And sort of the scientists talk about climbing as being like doing science, that, it's a kind of engagement with nature, but it's very different from what you do in the laboratory. But it's also something that requires total concentration. It's something where you have a very clear goal, and you have to break it down into a bunch of smaller technical steps, and then you have to execute each one of them. And in that way, it's sort of like doing scientific research, except it's outdoors. It engages different parts of your body and your mind. And it also has a very clear outcome, right? Either you reach the top of the mountain or the top of the rock, or sort of you don't, in contrast to scientific research, where it's often not clear that you're going either to succeed or to fail. For business people, in contrast, climbing especially mountain climbing, is like leadership, right? You have a team of people, you have to sort of get them to push past their boundaries, you have to have sort of a plan, but you also need to be flexible and to be able to improvise. And so each of them see in this activity that at one level is vastly different from their day jobs, elements that remind them of work at its very best. And I think that that this helps explain why it is that people who often are in very demanding careers, or are in people for whom time is extremely valuable, engage in these sort of hobbies that are time consuming, that are physically demanding, even sometimes dangerous. It's because it helps them reconnect with the things that they love about their work, that make that they feel make their life more meaningful. But they do so in a very different kind of context, and in a way that delivers clearer, sharper rewards more quickly. So I think that thinking of rest in this way, it helps clarify both its value and helps us begin to think about, all right, how can we bring this into our lives? How can we make choices that will help us rest better and have better lives ourselves?
And maybe it's a bit redundant, but then if this is like the kind of restorative resting, maybe to say it in a way, why being scrolling on social media or being so much time in our phone entertaining us is not really rest?
Partly it's that when you spend time on social media, part of what you're doing is using the same parts of your brain that you're engaging in the office, right? There's a certain amount of kind of social calculation and social and kind of self-presentation that is just similar enough to what happens in meetings, conference calls, etc., so that you're not actually necessarily resting the same parts of your brain, or you're not giving the parts of your brain that you use a lot at work a chance to to rest and recover. And I think also that again, that the fact that there is not an especially physical aspect to social media also plays into it, despite the fact that in American cities you can see plenty of people walking down the street on their phones. It's still not quite the same thing as taking a walk and just looking out into the middle distance and giving your eyes a break and letting your mind wander.
Do you think we are more open to rest after the pandemic? Do you sense overwork and burnout rose? Is the same, lower now?
I think that we are all trying to figure out what place work really ought to have in our lives. That a couple things have happened. Number one, no society can go through the loss of a few million people and not be affected by it, right? But also, the experience that many of us had working during the pandemic was one that, in which we had to make radical shifts really, really quickly, right? My wife is a teacher, and in the space of about 2 weeks, she had to figure out how to teach online in a way that she never had before, even though, she's at a pretty high tech school here, in the heart of the tech industry. And, what that raised was a sense that, or a realization that we can change how we work faster and more profoundly than we ever thought possible. And I think that has created a sense that, or a willingness to ask, are the ways that we are working actually sensible, right? Do they work for us? And can we do something different and better? And so I think that And part of that inevitably is to ask, how can we sort of design work to make more room sort of for the rest of our lives, right? To make more room for rest, for family, for community, that we're in a moment in which it's possible to sort of to envision a present and to envision a future of work that is not just characterized by increasing precarity and ever longer hours, but rather is one that is maybe defined by a greater sense of sort of balance between sort of work and the rest of our lives. And so I think that, yeah, this is a moment in which sort of rest is kind of having a moment, and people are trying to figure out sort of how to bring more of it into, both sort of their daily lives and sort of their life and the entire course of their lives.
That's why they should read Rest in the first place.
Exactly.
But actually, a lot of people that read Rest, and you even talk about this in the beginning of Shorter, then said like, okay, could you give us some hacks so we could be more productive and work less time and then have more free time? But there are some examples that you give that are very clear to me also, that it's not a matter of being more productive individually speaking. Like you were giving an example that you received a call in a radio show from mothers, working mothers, that maybe they cannot be more productive because they even have lots of tasks at home, at work, and on top of that, they feel guilty because they must be doing something wrong if they don't have free time. No,
Right.
and then there was a change in the system that was required, and then that was the beginning of Shorter, your third book, because first is Distraction Addiction, and then Rest, and then Shorter. But where did you find these unicorns, magical creatures that are companies that have either 4-day work weeks or work shorter hours than the rest? And how, I mean, I love this book because it's a framework to do it in your company. But how did this idea evolve, and how did you find these companies?
So, first off, I was looking more, it started off as a kind of broader exploration of different ways that companies were sort of were trying to incorporate rest into sort of their schedules. And so I was looking, for example, at companies that had installed nap pods, right? These kind of high-tech couches where you can sort of where you can sleep at work, looking at other kinds of programs. And then I started seeing these companies that had moved to sort of 4-day work weeks or other kinds of shorter hours without cutting salaries or changing expectations around output or productivity or client services. And pretty quickly, those emerged for me as sort of the most interesting cases because in a way they were the most radical. And I started looking at these maybe in 2018 or so. There weren't an awful lot of them at the time, but what I noticed was that they were all trying to solve the same kinds of problems around recruitment and retention, around burnout, around founder burnout, quite often. They were looking for ways to make their companies more sustainable in the long run. They recognized that sort of just kind of using people up and then discarding them was not a way that they were this is not a good strategy for sort of growth or creating the kind of workplace that sort of founders wanted. And that they were doing this and coming up with similar solutions in lots of different industries all around the world, but none of them knew about each other. And so that told me, this was a really interesting weak signal of a movement that was just starting to take off, that wasn't yet really aware of itself as a global movement, but which was doing some really interesting stuff and finally was important because it was making rest available for absolutely everyone in the company, right? This was not a story about rewarding your highest performers or your biggest earners or your top executives with 4-day weeks, but rather changing the entire company so that everybody from the bottom to the top could enjoy shorter work weeks. And in a way, this helped, and sort of that was the answer to one of the big questions that I always got, or when I was promoting Rest, which was, how does someone who is not an executive, right, who's working a regular 9-to-5 job, how do they take the lessons of Rest and put them into practice in their own lives? And one of the answers is by changing the way that companies themselves operate so that Rest and 4-day weeks become something available to everyone. And so at a tactical level, it meant figuring out how different, in different companies, in different countries, in different languages, how people talked about 4-day weeks, right? So in Japan and Korea, for example, news accounts tend to talk less about, don't use the term 4-day week. They talk about 3-day weekend. And so, and then in Iceland, there's an Icelandic term that means sort of better working as opposed to shorter hours. But better working has at the sort of functional level means reduction in working hours. So figuring out that kind of stuff was important for being able to get a sense of the global scope of the movement. But once I saw that it was global, that it involved a lot of companies that were trying to solve similar problems, and that they were coming up with similar kinds of solutions. At that point, I realized I had a story that was as good as the one that I had told in Rest, and that offered sort of a lot of really practical lessons for other people or companies who wanted to try this themselves.
Actually, that's what I love about the book, because it's full of research, but also great stories and very practical strategies. So I really love it. I recently had a discussion with a friend. He was really outraged because of an article from The Economist that pointed out that Mexico was one of the least productive countries. And he said, of course not. We are the country that works more hours in the world. Why are those two things completely different matters, being productive and working long hours?
Two things. Number one, that time spent at there's a lot of time spent at the office that is absorbed in very inefficient sort of activities. So there are studies that tell us that the average office worker loses something like 2 to 3 hours per day to overly long meetings, to technology-driven distractions, or to interruptions from colleagues, especially in open offices, right? Which are essentially like these open-air carnivals of distraction. And then in some countries like Japan and Korea, there's the expectation that, nobody leaves until the boss leaves. The boss always stays late, and then you're supposed to go out drinking with the boss, which doesn't do a whole lot of good stuff for anyone's productivity over the long run. And then finally, that in knowledge work, in professional services, it is a lot harder to draw a clear line between the number of hours you spend working on something and output, how productive you are. And I think that one of the great mistakes that we make as individuals and sort of as a society is to take the kind of industrial or agricultural model of work, which assumes that the more hours you put in, the more things you create, or the more acres you're able to harvest, and to translate that into creative endeavors or services where that doesn't really work very well. Consequence, so this helps explain why it is that, along with Mexico, South Korea, right, a place where people work very long hours, you go out with the boss, and generally you are discouraged from leaving the office ever. Also, suffers from surprisingly low levels of order productivity compared to other wealthy nations.
And actually, that was kind of the question I wanted to ask you, because I mean, there are lots of global cases from almost every region in the world, but one of the regions that is not really present is Latin America. Is there are there no really success stories there? Do you think that this culture, and especially maybe in Mexico, it's too present, this long hour culture, leave in the office, you cannot leave if the boss didn't leave, etc.?
I think there are places where the culture does make it harder, but not impossible. So Japan and Korea actually are two places in which you see a lot of companies experimenting with 4-day weeks. And these are not just places where, that are notorious for long hours. These are places whose languages have had to invent their own words for working yourself to death, right? This is a common enough phenomenon that there's a term for it. Now, I think that, what I am seeing is some adoption of 4-day weeks in Latin America now. So there are a few companies in Colombia, for example, that are doing it. In Peru. Brazil, we're actually launching a trial for 4-day week companies that builds on a few firms that have done it in the last year or so. And so I think that the good news is that while the region has not maybe moved as quickly as Europe or Australia or New Zealand, it's no longer sort of left out entirely. And certainly, if we could find local partners in Mexico or elsewhere with whom we could work to implement and to launch a trial, then we absolutely would love to do so.
We will volunteer gladly.
Absolutely.
Great. And actually, that was talking more about tactical things. In Mexico, in particular, people spend a lot of time in work, but also in commuting, especially in big cities like Mexico City or Monterrey or Guadalajara, which are like bigger and have more cars and everything. But they also sometimes arrive to the office and go 1 hour to take breakfast, then see social media 30 minutes, then do a personal errand, then work for a bit, then lunch is in 2 hours, and so on. So can this culture be fixed? I mean, the long hours is systemic, but losing time is sometimes an individual behavior, or are they related?
Well, I think that it is absolutely the case that you can you can change these behaviors, right? I think we see lots of examples of companies essentially having a kind of collective agreement in which the trade-off is we're going to have fewer distractions when we're working, right? We'll even create times of day when we don't have any meetings. Everyone can turn off Slack and email. And this is time for working really hard on your most important tasks where you need really deep concentration. And then there are other times of day where you'll set aside for meetings, for time with clients, or collaborative work. And in exchange for concentrating harder in those periods, you get an entire day back. And that there is virtually no place that doesn't have some combination of what you're talking about, right? A certain flexibility, a certain laxity in when people show up. Maybe people, are kind of mixing personal errands and work stuff, or shopping for groceries online during a conference call. And and part of the reason that we do that is, I think, the expectation that we're going to be at the office for a long time. And so we are in a sense quietly reclaiming some of that time for ourselves. What the 4-day week does is say, let's all work together to reclaim an entire day. And let's do it in ways that make that time more valuable, but also in the, along the way, also make our work better, make our work more meaningful, or to make it more engaging. And I think personally that this is, an approach that we have seen succeed all over the world, right? From, sort of Sweden or the UK to South Africa to sort of Asia, in places as different as Iceland and the United Arab Emirates. And so, I'm confident that no matter what kind of national culture or professional culture sort of you have, that this is a strategy, this is a way of working that if you want, you can figure out how to make work for you.
And actually, there are many examples in the book of how some companies reduce distractions. Some even had lights, so you couldn't get into the desk of someone if there was a red light.
Yes.
So you couldn't interrupt. But there's a specific topic you just talked about, and I don't think there is a lot of people who can say, I love meetings, I adore to be in a Zoom for hours. What are the best strategies you found in these different companies to reduce meetings, to make them more efficient and less time and life consuming?
Right. So one thing that meeting design or reform advocates, and there are such people, suggest doing is eliminating all your regular standing meetings, that 1 hour all hands on Monday morning, whatever, and require everybody who runs one of those meetings to make a pitch for why they should continue it. And if there's not a compelling case for continuing this meeting, then you get rid of it. So the first thing is meetings should have clear purposes. And if they don't, then don't hold them. Second, if they've got a purpose, that means that they ought to have an agenda, right? Specific things that you need to talk about, questions you need to answer, etc. Meetings also should have leaders and or facilitators, right? If they're bigger meetings, you might want to split that up. But having someone who is responsible for, for keeping the conversation going, making sure that all the important decisions get made, that everything gets talked about, having that role will make the meeting run better and will make better use of everyone's time. I think another thing is simply cutting the length of meetings in half is a really good experiment to try or discipline to practice. Most of us have meetings that are an hour long because that's what the default on our calendar programs is, and we never dive in and try and change it. And I think sometimes that the most powerful person in business in the last 30 years has not been like Peter Drucker or some other or Tony Robbins or some other management thinker, but rather whoever at Microsoft it was who decided that the default length of an Outlook meeting was going to be 60 minutes. And I think that the final thing that's really useful is to give people the option to actually not attend a meeting if they don't think that they can contribute productively to it. And making meetings shorter, making them smaller, making them more purposeful with specific things that need to be decided. These are all things. None of this is really complicated. They're all things that probably some bosses that we've encountered have done a little bit of, but you put them together and you can really make meetings much more effective, while also having many fewer of them and having them take up less of your time than they do right now.
And actually, I really like the hack that you can place the meetings in maybe in the afternoon and not in your best hours when your brain is like at their most capacity, or you're more rested to work in specific things that really need your attention. So I think that part was one of my favorite in the book, like these different hacks. In a world that is 24/7, how does these companies educated their clients to avoid emails or calls when they were shortening their working hours? How did they handle this part, or emergencies, for example?
That's a lovely question. And okay, so emergencies, I think that sort of every company who has successfully made a transition to a shorter work week tells clients or tells customers that if there is a genuine emergency, of course, we're going to pick up the phone, we'll be available, we will, it's just good professional practice to do that. And moving to a shorter work week is not about abandoning professional responsibilities, but finding ways to fulfill them more creatively than the competition. It's also the case, though, that if you present it well, your clients can be some of your biggest advocates for a shorter week on your behalf. I think if you make clear that this is why it is that you're doing it, that there are clear individual but also business benefits that come from shortening the work week. It'll help you be a more sustainable enterprise. It'll help you retain people, which, especially in professional services, is a really important thing. And you explain how it is that you're doing it. And, when there's an emergency, that you have a plan for dealing, then clients often are, at the worst, willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, and at best, see you as potentially solving problems that are endemic in their own lives. And so they want you to succeed because you can then show them how to bring this into their companies. So the fact that we all suffer from problems with overwork and burnout and recruitment and retention and work-life balance, or a promotion of women, etc. If you can help solve some of these problems, then that is going to be of great benefit to them. And it's a matter of communicating this in a way that makes clear that there will, that there's no downside for them, that this isn't about, sacrificing professional standards, and that in the long run, this is going to be beneficial for your people, which will mean it'll be beneficial for your business, which means it'll be beneficial for your customers as well.
What would be your advice for an employee who wants? What would be your advice for an employee who wants to take this to their HR, or maybe to a founder or a boss that wants to implement this, but they find a bit of resistance because maybe in Latin America we have more traditional schemes?
Right. Okay. So, first thing is there's a body of research now that has, through employee surveys, through looking at company performance, has shown that that at a baseline, it's possible to reduce working hours without any negative impact on salaries or on revenues, on profitability, and that at the same time this brings improvements in work-life balance, in company loyalty, etc. Things that over the long run can really move the needle for organizations. It's also the case that, okay, so there's that broad level, but then you get the question, all right, well, what about our industry, right? We're special. Okay, well, there are plenty of examples now of industries ranging from law firms to nursing homes to craft breweries and restaurants to creative agencies that have successfully made the transition to a 4-day week. So odds are you're going to be able to point to another firm, maybe not down the street, but certainly working in your own industry, maybe of a similar size, that has already done this. And I think for some for some business owners or executives, there is nothing like seeing someone else do it to convince them that this is something sort of worth trying themselves. And then I think as a strategic matter, it is really valuable to think about sort of executives as sort of as people who can enable and give permission and lead these initiatives with the support, with your support. I'm a big fan of like One Last Job movies, right? The ones where the spy has to come out of retirement because sort of something's happened and they've got to go back out into the field. And
like Sylvester Stallone.
Exactly, right. Or, Nicolas Cage has to steal 50 cars, or, every Fast and Furious movie. And,
exactly.
One of the things you see is that, okay, there is the central character, there's the Vin Diesel or Jason Momoa, but they always have a team of people working with them, right? You've got usually it's the computer hacker and the master of disguise and sort of the break-in person or the getaway driver. And so it's always a team effort. And I think that sort of, when I read stories or listen to accounts from executives of what made them decide to try a 4-day week in their companies, one of the things I very often hear is them telling the story of that team assembling to support their company doing a 4-day week. And so I think that if you can, there's no company that secretly does a 4-day week without the CEO knowing. You've got to get them on board. But I think that in addition to making the broad business case for a 4-day week, in addition to showing, to presenting case studies of companies maybe of similar size or in similar industries that have done this, telling the story of how they can be sort of the protagonist in this, and that there's a team of people who will support them in this effort, I think is the last big thing that you can do to sort of to help them envision launching one of these trials and making it a success.
And of course, I would suggest give them shorter. If they read it, of course, they will say yes, because they will find all this evidence. And I think it's a very, very enjoyable book also. It's really amazing what you did. So thank you so much, Dr. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, to be here in our YouTube channel, Little Capitalist Speak. And I'm really, really looking forward to read this next book you are working on. I love the fact that in your LinkedIn you can find rarely online, because I'm writing a new book. So I'm really, really looking forward to read it. And thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Si te encantó esta entrevista, te tengo una gran noticia, y es que Rest, el segundo libro del Dr. Alex Pang, está traducido al español. Se llama Descansa, produce más, trabaja menos, y pues lo puedes adquirir en Amazon o El Sótano. Si estás en España, también en Casa del Libro. Seguramente está en más librerías, pero yo ahí lo encontré perfectamente nada más entrando a Google. Así que le puedes echar un ojito en español o en inglés, como tú prefieras. Yo de verdad espero que Shorter pronto se traduzca también a español, porque necesitamos de verdad que en las compañías de Latinoamérica, y en especial de las de México, aprendamos a trabajar en esquemas donde podamos ser, sí, más productivos, más creativos, pero también tener una vida más balanceada, descansada y más satisfactoria. Cuéntame si te gustó la entrevista, cuál fue el comentario, el aprendizaje más importante que te llevas. Déjamelo en los comentarios y no olvides suscribirte al canal. ¡Mua!